I'm a partner at Matchstick Ventures, and I'm excited to do a session with you all on using goal setting and metrics to grow faster. Please add questions or comments in the chat. I'll be sure to check those out as we're going. We should have some time at the end to also do Q&A, and I love interacting with folks and making this more tangible and practical to you. So I'll probably start with maybe 20 minutes, 15 to 20 minutes worth of content here. It should be pretty practical stuff that you can take away and use right from the get-go, with some theory baked in as well. So thanks for being here. And I think I'm going to jump in here and go through the first part of this, and then we will, I'm going to switch the views here, but thanks for being with me. I want to start this session with a fun story from Mythbusters. Hopefully some of you have been fans of the show and watched it. There's a lot of great lessons to be learned in it. And the first we're going to start with is, in this episode, Adam is trying to swim across a lake, and he's wearing goggles that are completely blacked out, so he can't see where he's going. And so the goal is to start on this little peninsula on the left side and swim across towards this goal here. And they're curious to see what happens. So I'm not going to do a live Q&A here, but just think about, what do you expect happened when he actually jumped in the water and started swimming across with his goggles totally covered up and blacked out? What sort of obviously happened is he did not reach the goal, and this is the path that he actually took. So he ended up sort of corkscrewing around a little ways off the shore and never reached his destination. And the reason why was because he is right-handed, and he ended up, his right arm is a little bit stronger. And so he ended up sort of corkscrewing, because that played itself out over time. That bias in his physiology ended up making it impossible for him to reach his destination. And while this is sort of a fun story to kick things off here, what I see here is this common mistake that we make in startups, is we mistake motion for progress. And that's kind of what happened there. Was he kept, thinking he was reaching his destination, but he wasn't really going anywhere. And so what I'd like to do is, through this session here, is really help you not mistake motion for progress in your startup. And this is obviously very important, because we have limited time and resources as entrepreneurs. And so we really need to make sure that the effort and energy we're putting into our company is actually translating into progress. All right. So the big question is, how do you make progress? And let's jump into that. So things that create progress in a company are work that it creates customer value, which is kind of obvious, and work that improves the effectiveness of the organization. These are really the only two things you can focus on as a company at a startup stage. Things that destroy progress are work that seems like it should create customer value, but doesn't. So we got to avoid that. And then work that's caused by delays or mistakes. So it seems pretty obvious, but good things to have in the back of your mind. And so in part one here, we're going to focus on, how do you actually shift from motion to making progress? And we're going to do that through goal setting using OKRs. And I'll go through what that is. But I actually do want to do one little view change here. So hang with me real quickly here. I'm just changing this up here because I want to make sure I can see if there's any questions. So I'm just going to change this slightly here. So you should be able to see, I know it's not the best view, but you can still see the slides. I didn't want to do this view when we were looking at what happened with Adam swimming across the water there, because you could see the result. But we can do this now from here. And if anyone has any feedback on how the slides are looking or anything, feel free to put it in the chat, and I will make sure to address it. So great. So focusing on progress through goal setting using OKRs. So goals have a mission and an outcome. The mission paints a picture of the future that you're trying to achieve, and the outcome communicates the progress that you're making on the way. Some people also can call these objectives and key results, which is what OKR stands for. O for objectives and key results, KR. So these are commonly referred to as OKRs. And you may have heard of OKRs. They're pretty common. They were most known from Google, and people think that they were created at Google because Google's been a big advocate for them for a long time, but they were actually created at Intel before Google with Andy Grove, and Google sort of popularized it, but Intel really pioneered the use of OKRs. And so the use of what I'm going to teach today is not something that's maybe novel to the startup ecosystem now, but has been something that has worked for a long time for high growth companies. So let's talk about the first part of an OKR, which is the objective. So again, I'm just going to go back here. The objective, remember, paints a picture of the future. So this is sort of like, what is your goal and why is it interesting? So effective objectives. Oh, this is actually, I do need to switch actually the views here. Apologies, because I have a build on the slide. So give me 1 second here. All right. You're going to get to see like the weird tunnel there. Okay, this will actually be a little bit better here. Okay, great. So effective objectives. So I'm gonna teach you how to set good objectives because it's really important. They describe what you want to achieve, not what you want to do. So I'll go through a bunch of examples here. So you may say, oh, our objective is to implement a new marketing campaign. You want to ask yourself a helpful prompting question. So that what? Implementing a new marketing campaign is more of an action versus an outcome. So what would be a better way of saying this objective is increase signups through new marketing channels. So this is more around what you want to achieve, which is increasing signups versus what you actually want to do. And I'll go through a little bit later why that's powerful. So the second thing to have an effective objective is you want it to be specific enough to create focus, yet ambiguous enough to enable autonomy. So let's go through another example here. You might say, our objective right now for this week or this quarter or day or whatever it is to make our UI faster, our user interface faster. You can ask yourself, does this enable focus? A way to improve this would be to say, improve the responsiveness of the checkout page. If your goal or if your objective was to make our UI faster, you're not really sure what you're trying to do. It's too generic. But if you want to improve the responsiveness of the checkout page, much more specific, and it does enable more focus for whoever's taking on that task. On the ambiguous side of things, let's say we had an objective which was to create a dashboard with the top 6 sales performers. You can ask yourself, does this enable autonomy? And a better way of saying that would be enable the sales team to visualize the top performers. So here, we're not prescribing what the solution is because we may figure out through the work of this objective that creating a dashboard is actually not the best way to help the sales team visualize the top performers. And there might be a better way of doing it. So we want to make sure that it's ambiguous enough that more creative thought can go into the solution. Another way to make sure you have an effective objective is to know that the solution may not be known when you set the objective. And actually that's better because if the solution's already known, that's just prescribing work versus making sure that you create the space and energy for someone to get really creative. So for an example here, let's say your objective was to figure out how to increase add-on orders in your cart process. You can ask yourself, is not knowing how to do this holding back our ambition? So a better way of saying an objective like this might be increase add-on orders from our most engaged customers. So this is getting a little bit more specific. We don't really know how we're going to do it, but we know what we want to focus on. And that will then enable us to be creative around the solution. So when you're making objectives, these are the 4 questions to ask yourself. You can ask yourself, so that what, which helps make sure that you're going towards an outcome versus an output or something that isn't just measuring work happening. Does this enable focus? Does this enable autonomy? And is not knowing how to do this holding back our ambition? I think the most powerful of these is that so that what question. And if you take away nothing from how to make a better objective, I would focus on that question of so that what. Let's take the other side of the OKR, which is the key results. So key results are the part that is tracking the progress towards that vision. So good key results are outcome focused, not task completion focused, sort of similar to what we had in the objective side of things. So obviously these want to be measurable, which we'll talk about, but maybe the key result paired with one of your objectives is complete 100% of the new marketing plan tasks. You can ask yourself, are we measuring work done rather than actual results? Like what is, doing the 100% of the marketing plan tasks, what is that going to enable? And can we instead track what that enables? So a better way of doing that would be to say, increase new qualified leads from 100 per week to 150 per week. So the goal of doing the work on that marketing plan tasks is to actually increase new qualified leads from 100 to 150K. So let's just make that the key result. And we're much more likely to turn our work into actual value versus just getting credit for doing the work itself. Another way to make sure you have an effective key result is to make sure they're specific and measurable. So an example here might be, let's make the web application 50% faster. Might feel good about that because there's a number in there. We could track that. But you can ask yourself, is this specific enough? A better one would be to say the search results page load times go from half a second to a quarter of a second. Really much more specific, much more applicable to making sure you're adding value, and much more enables a lot more focus when someone's working on that OKR. Another part that's helpful when setting an effective key result is to make sure that you have a known starting value. It's amazing how many times you realize we actually don't know that number. So if we're going to do this work, why don't we go figure out what we're at today to make sure we're making it better? So a key result you might have is increase the sales pipeline. Obviously that's too generic. It's not measurable. So you can ask yourself, do we know the value right now to even know what we're trying to increase it from and to? And so instead, a better key result would be increase next quarter's sales pipeline from 1 million to 1.5 million. Much better, much more measurable. And there's probably a lot of learning and figure out what is our current sales pipeline today? One last one, and this is quite a, I think you all can probably see this. This is me tracking my time on what I'm doing. Is making sure that key results can be multiplied by 0.7. So this is sort of a theory in OKRs that to achieve success in your OKR, if you hit 70% of what your key result was, that's typically deemed as being successful, not 100%. So let's say, in that prior one, your goal was to increase the sales pipeline from 1 million to 1.5 million. Actually getting 70% of the way there is deemed success in an OKR, because you want to be able to think big. And if you don't hit 100% of your goal, it's okay. So one way of making sure that it's both measurable and you're thinking big is figure out, can it be multiplied by 0.7? So maybe your key result you thought was close one new customer. Yay, it's measurable, but and yay, it's sort of outcome versus output focused. What would be better is to ask yourself, is this a binary result? And what would be better would be to say we have 5 prospects past the contract negotiation side of things. Because if you got 3 of the 5, you'd probably be really excited about that as well. And that should really be success. And so it enables you to have a little bit more ambitious OKRs. So this is sort of the summary page of the questions you can ask yourself on key results. I listed the ones that we've already gone through and I added a few more on here. And if people want to have these prompting questions for your work, I'll put my email in the chat and I will be glad to send you these slides so you have them for your records. One thing I think that is important here is I've seen companies when they start to implement OKRs and good goal setting practices, they end up getting focused on setting the perfect goal. And I would argue that it doesn't really matter that you set a perfect goal. You're going to keep getting better and better and better, especially if you use these tools. But what you should focus on is the cadence of setting goals more so than setting the perfect goal. So building that into your daily, weekly, and monthly practice is really important. So then part 2 of this talk is we've set objectives, which is going to help us focus and make sure we know where we're going. The second piece here is tracking that progress through metrics. And going back to that Mythbusters example, really what they were doing was flying blind here. They weren't setting objectives. They weren't tracking their progress. And so he ended up sort of corkscrewing in and not making the progress he wanted. So hopefully with the objective setting, you know where you're going. And then tracking your progress would basically be like getting updates from people around you if you were swimming on where you're going and where you need to go. So tracking progress is through metrics. And this is typically through KPIs. KPIs stand for key performance indicators. Just is what it is. I do notice that people confuse key performance indicators and tracking progress with the key results of OKRs. And I just want to call it that those are different concepts, even though they sort of have similar acronyms, and try to keep those separate. So I'm going to kind of jump to I think on the key KPI side of things, it's worth, and metric side of things, it's worth sort of having a framework to think about it. So on the left side here, you'll see there are 3 different, we're basically going to put KPIs on here. And I want to give you a framework to think about them. So on the left side, you have generic, specific, and behavioral. And on the bottom, you have leading versus lagging. So what tends to happen here is you have different KPIs. On the right, I'm going to focus on the right side here on what I call accounting KPIs. So these tend to be lagging KPIs. So examples of a lagging KPI means it's something that is sort of the result of prior behavior. So I'll go through an example of what that is. And these tend to be generic. So it depends on, doesn't matter what kind of company you are, all companies have these sort of generic accounting KPIs. Then you have this sort of middle group, which are what I call investor KPIs. These are things that are a little bit more leading indicators in your business and more specific to your type of business. So if you're an e-commerce company, you have different investor KPIs than if you're a SaaS company, than if you're a brick and mortar restaurant, for instance. And then on this sort of upper left-hand side of things, you have management KPIs. So these tend to be more behavioral to your specific customer, specific to your type of business, and tend to be more leading indicators of good things happening in your business. And so what you can do is figure out for your type of business, what are the right KPIs that are both sort of accounting, investor, and management. So I'll put up here some examples of what these are. So the most canonical example of an accounting KPI is your cash balance. Every company has a cash balance, regardless if you're a restaurant, if you're a SaaS company, if you're an e-commerce company, everyone has a cash balance. This is also something that and it's also a lagging indicator. So your cash balance is the result of all of the work that you've done and the spending that you've done. So it's a lagging indicator of work that you've already been done. In some ways, it's a leading indicator of the work that you could do. But in this example, it's much more of a lagging indicator. So then more examples of investor KPIs might be MRR, so monthly recurring revenue. That's specific to a SaaS company. Daily active users, that might be more specific to a media company or a social networking company. Signups per day, depends what type of company you are, what your investor KPIs are. So you can see on the left side, these are becoming a little bit more specific, and they're also becoming a little more leading, meaning knowing how many months of burn you have can help you set forward-looking strategy. Knowing your monthly recurring revenue is both a look back at what have you done in terms of increasing subscription revenue, but is also an indicator of how much cash or capital you have to invest in the business. And then in the upper left are what I call management KPIs. And these are things that are just so specific to your business. A great example of this is when Facebook was in its early days, they found that users who had added a 7th picture to their account or profile or whatever were 99.7% likely to be hooked as a user. So this is obviously very specific and behavioral to Facebook's product. And it was just, they did this deep analysis around what really gets people to love our product. And it was by the time they had posted their 7th picture, they were 99.7% likely to be a really happy user. And so these management KPIs are where you're really trying to figure out what are these unique insights and metrics that we should be tracking for our type of business that really matter in our material. And so I think what you want to do is as you start on your entrepreneurial journey, you certainly should have your accounting KPIs, which are these sort of generic things that you need to run your business. You're going to have these more specific investor KPIs, which are things that are common for your type of business and that investors would expect to see. But then where you really want to eventually get to is these management KPIs, which are really unique to your business and help you really run your company. And so you can kind of see here, your goal is to build your sophistication up into the left here. And so just to sort of summarize on here, I don't know who's on the call and what your types of business are, but you should know for your business at all times, what are your top 1 to 3 KPIs at that moment in time? And you want to make them visible and review them daily within your company, especially as a startup, because they're changing pretty frequently. And actually, the reality is that if they aren't changing frequently, that sort of prompts you to think about, well, are we doing the right work here? Because these super important metrics, which are telling us how our business is doing, aren't changing. So are we really doing the right work? And then I think it's also worth recognizing that KPIs do change over time. And what is the most relevant KPI for you today may be different, and it's totally okay to change that over time. The pro move here is tying your key result from your OKR to movements in your KPIs. Obviously, a lot of acronyms there, but this should make sense, which is like when you're setting these objective and key results in your company, that key result or that, the objective that you're doing that's going to change some results in your business, if that is a change or movement in your KPI, that's obviously good because those KPIs are the health metrics of your company. So to sort of summarize here, my hope is that I help you make progress through goal setting, knowing where you want to go, and then tracking that progress through your metrics or your KPIs. Thank you. I'm going to jump in here to questions, but I'm going to need to change the view up real quickly here. Hold with me here for a second. Okay, so you should be able to see just this slide here. I want to make sure people have my email address. That's all the content I have for you here. I call that about 20 minutes on goal setting and KPIs for startups. I'm happy to answer any questions if anyone has any. Yeah, feel free to put those in the chat or the Q&A over here. I don't see any yet. You can also raise your hand. I see Amy here may have a question. I'm going to bring her on stage. And Amy, if you sort of accidentally hit a button and don't have a question, that's totally okay as well. Hi, Amy, are you there?
I am. I actually don't have a question at this moment, but yeah, it was a prompt that I had to push in order to get in.
Sorry, Amy, I couldn't hear you for a second there. Could you say that again?
This was just a button I had to push in order to get into this.
Oh, great. Okay.
Today, but thank you. Learning a lot.
You're welcome. You're welcome. I'll take you off the stage. Thanks for being here. All right. Does anyone else have any questions on this? Was there anything that stood out to you as particularly helpful? Something that stood out as particularly unhelpful or confusing or complex? I would be happy to jump into it. So let's see here. Great. I see a question here from Mike. As a VC, how important is it to you that companies have these in place before seeking funding from you? Thank you, Mike, for that question. I think it sort of depends on the stage of the company. If you're really early stage, you probably only have your accounting metrics in place, and that's totally fine, which is basically like, how much runway do you have? How much time can you spend on this company? Totally fine. As you start to build product and maybe you hire a team or you raise money, you're going to want to know some more of these metrics. So let me just update the slide here so we can just like know what we're talking about together. The more you know about these and you know what's important to you, the more you're going to stand out to an investor. So do you have to know them? No. If you do know them, you will stand out. And I do think that there are investors who will ding you for not knowing what the important metrics are in your business because they'll sort of expect that from you. So like, let's say you're a SaaS company and you have recurring revenue. If you don't know what your MRR is, it's going to sort of reflect poorly on you as an entrepreneur because that's a key metric in your company. Do you know the most behavioral metric possible for your company, or like Facebook did around their 7th picture posted? It's unlikely you're going to know that until you're 2, 3, 4, 5 years into a company. So do you have to have like deep sophistication around your management KPIs at the early stages? Probably not. Should you know your accounting KPIs and the specific investor KPIs for your business? Probably. And if you do know your management KPIs, I will tell you like that is a super easy way to stand out with investors, to say like, I know my business so well that, once we get a user to post their 7th photo with us, we have 99.7% likelihood that they're a customer for life. Like that's an amazing thing to know as an entrepreneur. So if you do know that, that's a great way to stand out. But most investors recognize that if you're at the early stages, you just may not know that yet because your company and your product and your customers are still just so young. So yeah, maybe to summarize that answer, the more you know, the better, and the more sophisticated you can be, the better. And if you do know them, you will stand out, but you don't have to know all of them, especially not your management KPIs, depending upon your stage. Mike, if I didn't answer that well enough or you had follow-up questions, feel free to jump in on the chat here. Peter asks here, in the behavioral metrics end, do you see companies investing in iterating or throwing away behavioral metrics? Do you prefer they identify a few they can track long-term? Yes, I see the management KPIs are changing all the time until you are more of a mature company and you have a repeatable usage pattern or sales process or something like that. So those are, you are iterating, like your accounting KPIs, you're not really changing that often because they're pretty standard. Your investor KPIs, also not changing them that often because they're kind of standard for your type of business. Management KPIs, changing all the time because you're trying to figure out like, what are these really unique behavioral elements of my distinct, unique product? And so, yeah, I see companies thinking that they have, oh man, this is a great behavioral KPI or a management KPI for us. And then we track it for a few months and we realize, wow, that actually is not really driving value in the way that we thought it would. And so we try something else. So I think your goal is to really be curious in that upper left quadrant there and try to figure out what stands out for you. And it is worth tracking them for a long time because sometimes it's hard to find, is this just a correlation or is this a causal relationship? Ideally, you have a causal relationship like Facebook did with the percentage of new users posting that 7th picture. Like they really determined that was causal versus a correlation. So you do want to track them for a while. And I think it's really fun to get into the nitty gritty here and start to think creatively like, okay, like let's look at the usage patterns of our product. What might be some of these management KPIs that we're really seeing gets people to really stick with our product and be really happy with it. And then start tracking that. I can give you an example from my startup, which I started in 2008, which was a travel blog site. And so anyone could sign up for it and upload photos, videos, stories, reviews of a travel experience. Like let's say you were going to China and you were hiking the Great Wall of China and you want to blog about that trip, you would use our software for it. We found that when someone had over 7 followers, ironically the same number, had over 7 followers on that trip, they were, I think it was like 75% more likely to keep adding content because they knew people were paying attention to it. Another metric we saw was for every time that a blog got a comment, it resulted in like 80% higher retention over the next week for those users. And basically what was happening there was that the bloggers were getting a positive feedback loop of people engaging with their content, which encouraged them to post and create more content. So like that was, obviously that's a very unique or behavioral KPI to the company that I had, which was percentage of travel blogs that were getting comments within the last week. Like talk about a very behavioral management KPI, so unique to my business. Like literally, we might've been the only business in the world that cared about that KPI, but it was a really important one to us. So those are examples of behavioral KPIs and how specific and unique they might be to your company. So Peter, I hope that's a helpful answer to your question. If you'd like to ask a follow-up, feel free to do so in the chat. Yeah, Peter has a great comment in here around there's a dynamic in this where you first sort of identify sticky factors with your product, and then you start tracking what drives them. And I think that's a great way of putting it, Peter. You're right. You're trying to figure out like, why are people sticking with us? Why do people continue to use us? What makes them happy in our product? Start tracking that's happening, and then start figuring out like what is actually driving that work or that behavior or that pattern in your user base. And then that starts showing up and impacting your product roadmap because you may design different customer experiences or user journeys to make sure that you get more and more people to create or have that experience. because, having or creating that experience is going to lead to a stickier or more engaging product. So yeah, Peter, that's a great point. Thank you for chiming in on that.